Every year, millions of people receive flood warnings on their phones. We check the weather, watch the news, and leave before the water arrives. But for almost all of human history, none of that existed. There were no forecasts, no satellites, no emergency alerts, and no one to tell you what was coming. Yet, ancient humans somehow survived floods for thousands of years. So how did they know when it was time to run? The answer wasn't hidden in the sky alone. It was hidden in the rivers, the sky, the animals, and the countless signs that most of us no longer notice. When most people think about a flood, they imagine it happening without warning. The sky suddenly turns dark. Heavy rain begins to fall. Within minutes, water is rushing through homes and everything is too late. It feels as if floods appear out of nowhere, but that is not how nature usually works. Long before the water reaches a village, the environment often begins to change. The problem is not that the warnings are missing. The problem is that most modern humans no longer know how to recognize them. Ancient humans had no choice but to pay attention. Their survival depended on noticing the smallest changes around them. A river that sounded louder than usual. A strange smell in the air after days of heavy rain. Water flowing faster than it had the day before. None of these signs guaranteed that a flood was coming, but together they told an important story. Over thousands of years, people learned that nature followed patterns. A river that had stayed calm for months could suddenly behave differently. Water might become cloudy as fast-moving currents carried mud and broken branches from upstream. Small streams could begin rising before the main river changed at all. These were not random events. They were clues. Ancient humans did not understand rainfall with satellites or computer models. Instead, they learned from experience. Every flood that a community survived became a lesson. Parents shared those lessons with their children. Elders remembered which valleys filled with water first and which hills stayed dry. After enough generations, this knowledge became almost as valuable as food or fire. That is why many ancient settlements were not built by accident. People often chose higher ground, natural terraces, or places that had remained safe during earlier floods. Archaeologists have found that many early communities repeatedly settled in locations that offered better protection from seasonal flooding, showing that these choices were based on long observation rather than luck. In other words, ancient humans were not predicting floods the way we think of weather forecasts today. They were reading a landscape that had been teaching the same lessons for generations. But even the most experienced people were not always the first to notice that something was wrong. Sometimes the earliest warning came from creatures that had been quietly watching nature long before humans realized anything had changed. Imagine waking up one morning and noticing that the birds outside have suddenly gone silent. The frogs that filled the riverbank every evening have disappeared. Even the insects seem less active than they were just a day before. To most of us, these changes would mean very little. But to ancient humans, they could mean everything. People who lived close to nature quickly realized that animals often reacted to danger before humans did. They did not know the science behind it, but they noticed the pattern. Just before floods, certain animals behaved differently. Birds abandoned low nesting areas. Ants carried their eggs to higher ground. Frogs moved away from rising water. Fish sometimes gathered in unusual places as rivers changed around them. Modern researchers have documented many of these behaviors. Scientists believe animals can respond to subtle environmental changes that humans rarely notice, including shifts in water levels, ground vibrations, humidity, and even changes in air pressure before major storms. Different species react in different ways, but together they can create an early warning that something unusual is about to happen. Ancient humans were careful observers. They did not watch animals out of curiosity. They watched them because their own survival often depended on it. Imagine seeing a colony of ants climbing far above the ground after days of steady rain. By itself, that might not mean much, but if the river was also flowing faster than usual, birds were leaving the area, and dark clouds had begun gathering over distant hills, those separate clues started forming a much bigger picture. This is something many people misunderstand. Ancient humans were not waiting for one magical sign that predicted every flood. They were collecting dozens of small signals at the same time. That was their real advantage. The forest, the river, the weather, and the animals were all giving tiny pieces of information. The skill was knowing how to put those pieces together before it was too late. Even then, animals could only tell people that something was changing. They could not reveal where the danger would come from, or how serious it would become. For that, ancient humans turned their attention to something they trusted even more than the animals themselves: They watched the river, and the river almost always spoke before it flooded. If ancient humans wanted the clearest warning, they did not look at the sky first. They looked at the river. To most of us, a river is just flowing water. We might notice if it is high or low, but little else. Ancient humans saw something completely different. They saw a living system that was constantly changing, and every change meant something. One of the earliest signs was the water itself. After heavy rain far upstream, a river often changed color before it changed size. Clear water could suddenly become cloudy as fast-moving currents carried mud, sand, broken branches, and pieces of plants from miles away. Someone standing beside the river might never have seen the storm, but the river had already brought the evidence downstream. Then came the current. People who crossed the same river every day knew exactly how it normally behaved. They knew where the water moved slowly, where it formed quiet pools, and where it rushed around rocks. If those familiar patterns suddenly changed, it was rarely ignored. Even the sound could be different. A faster river crashes harder against rocks and riverbanks. It carries more debris. It produces deeper, louder, and more continuous noise. To someone who had lived beside that river for years, the difference could be obvious long before the water reached dangerous levels. Ancient humans also paid attention to places where smaller streams joined larger rivers. These narrow channels often rose first, acting like an early warning system. If a small stream that was usually calm suddenly became fast and muddy, people knew that far more water was already moving through the landscape. The main river might still look safe, but it was only a matter of time before everything downstream began to change. This is something many people never think about. A flood does not begin where you are standing. It often begins many miles away. Heavy rain falling in distant hills or mountains can send enormous amounts of water downstream hours later. By the time the flood reaches you, the storm that caused it may already be over. Ancient humans did not understand watersheds or hydrology in scientific terms, but they understood patterns. Generation after generation taught them that rivers always left clues before they became dangerous. Those who noticed the clues early climbed to higher ground. Those who ignored them often paid a terrible price. But even the river could not tell the whole story. Sometimes the most important warning was not in the water at all. It was hanging silently above them, hidden in the shape of the clouds, the direction of the wind, and the heavy feeling in the air before the first drop of rain ever fell. Long before the river overflowed, ancient humans often looked somewhere else. They looked at the sky, not because they could predict the weather the way meteorologists do today, but because they knew the sky was constantly changing. And those changes often came before the flood itself. They learned that not all clouds were the same. Thin white clouds drifting high above usually meant little. But when dark clouds began building higher and higher over distant hills, especially during the wet season, experienced hunters and gatherers paid attention. They knew those clouds could release enormous amounts of rain many miles away, even if their own camp was still dry. That was an important lesson. A flood did not need rain where you were standing. Rain falling far upstream could be enough to send a wall of water racing down the river hours later. The wind was another clue. People who spent their entire lives outdoors became familiar with normal wind patterns in different seasons. When those patterns suddenly changed, bringing warm, heavy air or powerful gusts before a storm, it often signaled that the weather was becoming unstable. Then there was the air itself. Have you ever stepped outside and felt that the air suddenly seemed thick and heavy before a storm? That feeling is usually caused by rising humidity. Ancient humans did not know the word hibity, but they certainly noticed the sensation. Over generations, they learned that when the air felt different, the weather often changed soon afterward. Thunder also carried information. A storm rumbling in the distance was not just noise. It told people that large amounts of rain were already falling somewhere beyond the horizon. Even if the sky above their camp was still clear, they understood that rivers could soon begin carrying that rain toward them. This is where a common myth begins. Many people imagine that ancient humans survived because they had incredible instincts or mysterious abilities. The reality was much simpler. They survived because they paid attention to patterns that repeated over and over again. The sky was not giving them magical warnings. It was giving them information, and generations of careful observation taught them how to understand it. But even the sky could not answer the most important question. Knowing that heavy rain was coming was only half the battle. The real challenge was knowing where the floodwater would go, and ancient humans found that answer by studying the land itself. Imagine standing in a valley that looks peaceful today. Green grass covers the ground. Birds are singing. A river flows quietly nearby. Nothing about it looks dangerous. But ancient humans knew that appearances could be deceiving. The land has a memory. Every major flood leaves behind clues, and those clues can remain for years, decades, or even centuries. Long before geology became a science, ancient humans learned to read those clues simply by living with the landscape. One of the clearest signs was the shape of the land itself. After many floods, rivers carve wide, flat areas beside their banks, called floodplains. These places are rich in fertile soil because every flood leaves behind fresh layers of mud and minerals. They are excellent for plants, but they are also the first places to disappear underwater when the river rises again. Ancient people eventually recognized this pattern. A place that had flooded before was likely to flood again. That simple lesson influenced where many communities chose to live. Archaeologists have found that numerous ancient settlements were built on natural hills, rocky terraces, or slightly raised ground overlooking nearby rivers. The people still stayed close enough to reach fresh water, catch fish, and travel along the river, but they also reduced the risk of being caught by seasonal floods. Even trees could reveal the past. In some places, lines of debris trapped in branches showed how high earlier floods had reached. Unusual layers of mud, piles of driftwood, or stretches where vegetation looked different from the surrounding land all hinted that water had once covered the area. These were not random details. They were warnings left behind by previous floods. This is where another common myth falls apart. Many people imagine ancient humans wandered wherever they pleased and simply hoped for the best. The evidence suggests something very different. The longer people lived in one region, the better they understood its habits. They remembered which valleys flooded first, which paths became rivers after heavy rain, and which hills stayed dry even during the worst storms. That knowledge was passed from one generation to the next, making every flood a lesson instead of just a disaster. In a way, the landscape became a history book. There were no written pages, no maps showing danger zones. Only the marks that nature had carved into the earth itself, waiting for someone who knew how to read them. But even all of this knowledge had one important weakness. Sometimes nature broke its own patterns. And when it did, even the wisest observers could be caught completely by surprise. By now, it might sound as if ancient humans always knew when a flood was coming. But that is not true. Nature is full of patterns. It is not full of guarantees. Ancient humans became incredibly skilled at reading rivers, watching animals, and studying the sky. Those signs helped them avoid danger countless times. But there were moments when nature completely broke its usual rhythm. One of the most dangerous examples was the flash flood. Unlike the slow rise of a large river, a flash flood can form with frightening speed. Heavy rain falling over nearby hills or steep valleys can send huge amounts of water rushing downhill in a very short time. A dry stream can become a powerful river before anyone has time to react. Even today, flash floods remain among the deadliest natural disasters because they develop so quickly. Ancient humans understood that some places were simply too risky during certain seasons. Narrow valleys, steep canyons, and dry riverbeds could look perfectly safe in the morning, yet become deadly by the afternoon. That is why experience mattered so much. Communities that had survived previous floods remembered which places became dangerous first. Those memories were shared with children long before they were old enough to hunt or gather food. Survival was not just about being strong. It was about remembering lessons that someone else had already learned. This is where another common myth falls apart. Many people believe ancient humans survived because they were fearless. The reality was almost the opposite. The smartest groups were often the most cautious. If the river behaved strangely, they did not wait for proof. If animals suddenly abandoned an area, they paid attention. If distant thunder echoed through the hills for hours, they prepared for the worst. Sometimes they moved their camps even when no flood ever arrived. From a modern point of view, that might seem like a mistake. For ancient humans, it was a small price to pay. Leaving a campsite early might waste a day's journey. Ignoring the warning could cost an entire community. That simple way of thinking helped people survive for thousands of years in a world where second chances were rare. And perhaps the most remarkable part of all is this. Many of the warning signs ancient humans trusted are still used today. Modern technology has made them easier to measure, but the basic idea has hardly changed. We are still watching the same rivers, the same skies, and the same patterns that guided our ancestors thousands of years ago. It is easy to think that modern technology replaced everything ancient humans once knew. After all, today we have satellites orbiting Earth, weather radars scanning the skies, and computer models that can predict storms days before they arrive. It feels like we left the ancient world behind. But in reality, we did not. We simply found better ways to measure the very same clues. Take a modern flood warning, for example. Meteorologists study how much rain is falling, where it is falling, how quickly rivers are rising, and how saturated the ground has become. Powerful computers process that information and send alerts to millions of people. It sounds completely different from the ancient world, yet the basic idea is exactly the same. Ancient humans watched the river. Today we install river gauges. Ancient humans watch the sky. Today satellites watch it from space. Ancient humans noticed changes in animals in the landscape. Today scientists monitor water levels, soil moisture, and weather patterns using instruments that can detect changes far too small for the human eye. The technology has changed, nature has not. A river still rises after enough rain. The ground still becomes saturated before it can absorb more water. Storm clouds still build in the atmosphere before they release their rain. The same natural rules that protected ancient humans are still protecting us today. The biggest difference is that many of us no longer notice them ourselves. Instead, our phones do the watching for us. This is where another common myth quietly falls apart. People often believe technology replaced human observation. In reality, technology expanded it. Every weather forecast is built on patterns that have always existed. Modern science simply helps us see those patterns earlier, more accurately, and across much larger distances than our ancestors ever could. In a way, every flood warning you receive today is the result of thousands of years of human observation, passed from one generation to the next and refined by science. That is an extraordinary thought. The phone in your pocket and the hunter standing beside a river thousands of years ago were trying to answer exactly the same question. Is it still safe to stay here? And the answer to that question reveals something remarkable about ancient humans that is often overlooked. They did not survive because they were lucky. They survived because they learned to trust patterns that the natural world had been quietly repeating all along. Imagine surviving a flood so powerful that it destroys your camp, sweeps away your food, and nearly takes your family with it. If you survive, what do you do next? You remember, and you make sure your children remember too. This may have been the most important flood warning system ancient humans ever created. Not a tool, not an animal, not a river. Memory. Long before writing existed, knowledge was stored in stories, rituals, and repeated experiences. Elders remembered which valleys filled with water first. They remembered which hills stayed dry during the worst storms. They remembered the season when the river became dangerous and the signs that appeared before the water arrived. Those memories were not treated as interesting stories. They were survival instructions. Anthropologists have found that many traditional societies pass environmental knowledge through oral traditions. Stories about dangerous rivers, sacred hills, or forbidden places often contain practical information hidden inside them. A tale that warns children never to camp near a certain bend in the river may sound mythical, but it can also preserve the memory of a catastrophic flood that happened generations earlier. This is one reason ancient flood stories appear in cultures all over the world. Mesopotamia, India, China, the Americas, and many other regions contain traditions describing great floods. Historians do not assume all of these stories describe the same event, but they do show something important. Floods were memorable enough to become part of cultural memory, and cultural memory can last much longer than a human life. Think about what that means. A child could learn about a dangerous flood that happened 100 years before they were born. By the time that child became an elder, they could pass the warning to another generation. The original witnesses were gone, but the lesson survived. In a world without books, this was incredibly powerful. Modern scientists sometimes call this traditional ecological knowledge. It is information gathered through long experience with a particular landscape and passed from generation to generation. Researchers working with indigenous communities around the world have found that such knowledge can include detailed observations about rivers, storms, seasonal changes, and other environmental patterns. Ancient humans were not just watching nature in the moment. They were building a library of floods inside their culture, and that library may have saved more lives than any single warning sign ever could. A river can warn you for a few hours, a storm cloud can warn you for a day, but a story can warn people for centuries. That is why the final answer to our question is much bigger than it first appears. Ancient humans did not survive floods because they could magically predict the future. They survived because they combined observation, experience, and memory, and then passed that knowledge forward so the next generation did not have to learn every lesson the hard way. The next time your phone sends a flood warning, take a moment to think about what that alert really represents. It is not just a message on a screen. It is the result of thousands of years of human observation. Long before satellites watched the clouds and computers measured river levels, ancient humans were already learning the same lessons directly from nature. They watched the sky. They listened to rivers. They noticed the behavior of animals. They remembered where the land had flooded before, and they passed those lessons to the next generation. They did not survive because they could predict the future. They survived because they understood the patterns of the natural world better than most of us ever will. In many ways, modern flood forecasting still follows the same idea. The tools have become more advanced, but the question has never changed. What is nature trying to tell us? That may be the greatest lesson ancient humans left behind. The world is constantly giving us information. The rivers are changing, the sky is changing, the land is changing. The difference is that today, we often wait for a notification to tell us what our ancestors learned to see with their own eyes. Ancient humans did not invent weather forecasts, but they did something just as remarkable. They learned how to read the world around them. And that knowledge helped countless generations survive long before modern technology ever existed. If you enjoyed uncovering this ancient mystery, don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more surprising stories from the lives of ancient humans waiting to be explored.